The wilderness beckons. The frontier was never quiet. To those who had never seen it, the word wilderness suggested emptiness, a vast silence waiting to be filled by human hands. But the truth was far richer, more complicated. Long before the settlers packed their wagons, before the echo of axes rang through forests, the land was alive. Bison thundered across wide prairies, their hooves shaking the earth. Rivers carved deep channels into the soil, singing songs that had flowed. For centuries, native tribes hunted, traded, and preyed on these lands, weaving their lives into the rhythm of the seasons. The frontier was not empty, it was full, brimming with its own kind of order, its own kind of history. Yet, to the restless families in the cities and crowded farms of the East, it was a horizon of hope. In New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, streets were crowded with smoke from chimneys, markets bursting with noise, and tenements filled with too many voices in too small spaces. In those places, the air often felt heavy, the opportunities scarce. For many, the stories of the frontier came as whispers, carried by travelers and newspapers. There is land, endless land, if you dare to take it. Land where a man may be poor one day and rich the next. Land where you can build, from nothing, everything. It was those whispers that called them west. A wagon train was not a romantic adventure, it was a gamble with fate. Wooden wheels, bound with iron rims, creaked under the weight of barrels, tools, blankets, and hope itself. Oxen and mules trudged forward, ribs showing, their breath steaming in the cold dawn. Families climbed aboard or walked beside, boots sinking into mud or dust, depending on the season. The journey west was slow, and every mile felt heavier than the last, but there was no turning back. To turn back was to admit failure. Nights on the trail were long and uncertain. Campfires flickered, throwing shadows across tired faces. Fathers sat with rifles across their knees, eyes sharp, listening to every rustle beyond the firelight. Mothers stirred iron pots with thin rations, beans, salted pork, or cornbread if flour could be spared, while children slept curled under quilts patched from scraps of old lives left behind. And always, in the distance, came the sounds of the wild wolves calling to each other, the wind sighing through tall grass, owls hooting from hidden branches. But not every sound was from the wilderness. Sometimes, other voices drifted across the night, native hunters watching silently, or rival wagon trains passing nearby, each group measuring the other in wary glances. The frontier was both promise and peril. For the settlers, it was land to be claimed. For the tribes who had lived there for centuries, it was home already claimed. The clash between those two truths would echo for generations. Still, hope drove the wagons forward. It was not only land that people sought, but freedom. Freedom from the debts that chained farmers to rocky soil in New England. Freedom from the crushing weight of poverty in the slums of growing cities. Freedom from persecution for immigrants who carried strange accents and foreign faiths. The frontier promised that here, in this vast and untamed land, a man's worth would be measured not by his name or his past, but by his courage and his labor. The untold part of this story is that the West was not only conquered by rugged men with rifles and axes, it was built by women who stitched together families under canvas tents, who bore children on the trail, who taught sons and daughters their letters by firelight. It was built by freedmen who traveled west after the chains of slavery fell, determined to plant roots in soil no one could take from them again. It was built by immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Germans leaving war, Scandinavians searching for land where winter was still harsh but survival offered dignity. Each carried traditions, prayers, and songs that would eventually blend into the strange, uniquely American music of the frontier. At sunrise, the wilderness revealed its majesty and its indifference. The sky spread so wide it seemed to swallow the earth, painted in pinks and golds as the sun climbed higher. The smell of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke filled the air. Children, rubbing sleep from their eyes, looked upon rivers that gleamed like silver snakes, or forests so thick they seemed endless. To them, it was not only hardship but adventure. Each new bend in the trail promised wonders no book or story could match. And yet, every family knew behind the beauty lurked danger. Floods could wash away wagons in minutes. A single rattlesnake bite could take a life before sundown. Drought could turn promising farmland into dust. The frontier gave much, but it demanded more. It was a bargain written not in ink, but in sweat and sacrifice. Still, people pressed forward. They did not see only the perils. They saw farms rising from prairies, towns growing where trails crossed, schools where their children might learn, churches where their voices might rise in him. To them, the frontier was not just land, it was a future. The wilderness beckoned, not with gentleness but with a fierce challenge. Are you strong enough? Will you endure? Will you build something that lasts? Thousands answered. They stepped into that vast unknown, carrying their hopes, their fears, and their determination. And in doing so, they began the story of a nation that would be forever shaped by the frontier spirit. The first winter on the frontier was never just a season, it was a trial, a reckoning. Families who had stepped into the wilderness with shining eyes and swelling hearts soon found themselves staring at nights so cold that the very breath froze on their lips. Snow came early and heavy, blanketing the prairies in silence. What had seemed like a land of promise in the golden glow of summer fields now revealed its harsher truth. It was a place that gave nothing without demand. Cabins were hurriedly built before the frost set in. Logs were felled, dragged into rough squares, and sealed with clay or mud to keep the wind out. Roofs were laid with bark, then thatched with whatever could be found: straw, reeds, sometimes even animal hides. Inside, the cabins smelled of smoke and earth, cramped with the belongings of entire families. At night, the fire was fed carefully, every ember guarded like treasure. Mothers wrapped children in quilts, pressing them close to keep the chill from seeping into their bones. Food became the first fear. The bounty carried in wagons: flour, beans, salted meat was never enough to last through a long winter. Hunting helped, but game grew scarce as the snows deepened. Men trudged out with rifles into the icy woods, following faint tracks of deer or rabbit, their boots crunching in silence. Sometimes they returned with a kill slung over their shoulders. Other times they came back empty-handed, their faces shadowed with worry. Children's stomachs growled through the night, and mothers learned to stretch meals thinner, boiling bones for broth, mixing flour with snow to make it last. But hunger was not the only danger. Sickness crept easily into cramped cabins. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers into funerals. A child's life could be stolen by pneumonia in a matter of days. With no doctors nearby, families relied on old remedies: herbs gathered in summer, teas brewed from bark, prayers whispered into the night. Every grave dug into the frozen ground was a reminder that the wilderness was not a storybook dream. It was survival, raw and unrelenting. Yet even in the harshness, moments of grace glimmered. On the coldest nights, neighbors gathered in one cabin to share heat and song. German settlers brought fiddles. Irish immigrants sang ballads of faraway green hills. Freedmen lifted voices in hymns of hope and freedom. These gatherings stitched the people together, reminding them that even in the loneliest wilderness, they were not truly alone. The firelight on their faces, the shared bread, the echo of music across the snow, these were the sparks that kept spirits alive when the wind tried to snuff them out. The native tribes watched the settlers struggle with mixed emotions. To some, the suffering was a just lesson for those who dared intrude on sacred land. To others, compassion stirred. Stories spread of tribes bringing venison or maize to starving families, of women showing frontier mothers how to grind roots or weave warm coverings. But just as often, stories told of raid settlers who lost livestock or supplies to bands determined to protect what was theirs. The frontier was not merely a battle with nature, it was a fragile line between coexistence and conflict. The children, however, often saw things differently. To them, the snow was both hardship and wonder. They built forts from drifts, slid on frozen ponds, and laughed in the very face of the cold that so tormented their parents. In their innocence, they carried the dream forward, proof that the human spirit finds light even in the darkest winters. Parents looked at their children and found strength. They told themselves, "We did not come here for ourselves alone. We came for them, for their future." By spring, those who endured bore the look of hardened survivors. Their hands were calloused, their faces lined with windburn, but their eyes carried a quiet fire. They had seen what the frontier demanded, and they had paid the price. Some wagons never made it. Families turned back east, defeated, but those who stayed planted seeds in thawing soil with a deeper resolve. If they could endure the winter, they could endure anything. The first green shoots breaking through the snow were more than crops, they were symbols. Every stalk of corn, every sprig of beans, was a declaration, "We are still here. We will not be broken." The wilderness had tested them, and though it had claimed some, others stood taller for it. The first winter was the true frontier baptism. It burned away illusions, stripped families down to their core, and revealed what they were truly made of. And for those who emerged from it, the land no longer seemed like an enemy. It was a harsh teacher, yes, but also a partner. If you respected it, worked it, and endured its trials, it would, in time, give back. And so, when the sun rose on that first spring, the settlers looked out at the horizon with new eyes. The wilderness still beckoned, but now they understood. It was not a land to be conquered in haste. It was a land to be earned, with patience, sweat, and sacrifice. And they were ready. The towns rise from the dust by the third year of settlement. The wilderness began to change. Where there had once been only endless grass, cabins now stood in clusters. Trails, once little more than wagon ruts, became roads, hardened by hooves and boots. Smoke curled upward from chimneys, and the sound of axes and hammers filled the air. The frontier was no longer just scattered families clinging to survival. It was beginning to birth towns. At first, these towns were nothing more than crossroads, a trading post set up beside a wagon route, a blacksmith's forge to shoe horses, a saloon where weary men gathered to drink away dust and hunger. But even these small beginnings mattered. A place with 2 cabins became a place with 10, and soon a cluster of buildings marked the map where before there had been only wilderness. With each season, the frontier grew less wild and more human. Life in these towns was harsh, yet strangely hopeful. A settler might walk down a muddy main street and hear a mix of languages, German lullabies sung to babies, Irish voices calling from taverns, English farmers bargaining for seed. Freedmen carried with them the rhythms of spirituals, their songs, rising on Sunday mornings outside wooden churches still rough-hewn and unpainted. In this mix, something new began to form, a rough tapestry of cultures stitched together by necessity and hunger for survival. But with growth came tension. Where land was settled, hunting grounds shrank. Where cabins rose, old trails disappeared. Native tribes, who had lived with the rhythm of rivers and herds for centuries, saw their world narrowing. Some sought peace-trading skins for iron pots, corn for blankets. Others resisted fiercely. Raids flared along the edges of settlement. Horses stolen, wagons burned, arrows piercing the silence of dawn. In retaliation, militias formed, men with rifles patrolling roads, sometimes striking back with merciless fury. This clash of worlds gave the towns an edge of unease. At night, saloons buzzed with speculation. Would there be another raid? Would the army send protection? Were treaties worth the paper they were written on? The frontier was not only a place of freedom but of fear, and fear, when fed too long, often became violence. Still, people built. They built, because to stop building meant surrender. Wooden churches rose with steeples pointing to the sky. Schools were fashioned out of log huts, where children sat on rough benches, scratching letters on slates. A man who had spent his life in silence now heard his daughter sound out words by firelight, and he knew the suffering was worth it. A woman who had feared starvation now tended a garden of beans and squash, her children's bellies full. For the first time in years, these small triumphs gave the settlers the strength to keep going. Law came slowly, often carried not by officials but by men who appointed themselves guardians of order. A sheriff's star was sometimes nothing more than a piece of tin hammered into shape. Justice was swift and rough, sometimes fair, sometimes cruel. A thief might be locked in a crude jail, but a horse thief could find himself swinging from a tree before sundown. The law was not written in books, but in the hard decisions of men trying to keep chaos at bay. And yet, amidst the danger and the dust, a strange joy lingered. On Saturdays, towns came alive. Farmers brought wagons loaded with vegetables, trappers laid out pelts, and blacksmiths displayed iron tools still warm from the forge. Fiddles played, boots stamped in dances, and voices rang with laughter. It was not civilization as the East had known it. It was raw, uneven, and fragile. But it was life, vibrant and determined. What the frontier taught most of all was resilience. A family who lost a cabin to fire would find neighbors gathering, axes in hand, to rebuild. A widow with children would wake to discover food left quietly at her door. Hardship had carved these people, but it had also bound them together. They knew that alone they could not stand, but together they could endure. By the time the sun set on these young towns, lanterns glowed in windows, voices drifted from saloons, and dogs barked at passing wagons. A stranger walking through might think it small, rough, even lawless, but to those who had carved it out of the wilderness, it was more than a town. It was proof that the frontier could be tamed, one plank, one nail, one breath at a time. Still, every man and woman who lay their head down in those towns knew the truth. The frontier was never fully tamed. The wilderness still pressed at the edges, vast and untouchable. Storms could sweep away crops in an hour. A single spark could burn a town to ash. An uneasy peace with the tribes could break with one angry shot. The towns rose from dust. Yes, but dust. They remained fragile in the great sweep of time. And yet, that fragility did not weaken the settlers. It gave them strength. Each sunrise was not only a new day, but a victory. Each child's laugh, each barn built, each hymn sung was a declaration that against all odds, life could root itself in the hardest soil. The frontier was not just wilderness anymore. It was becoming community. And though the line between chaos and order was as thin as the horizon itself, people stepped forward with courage, determined to write their story on the land. Guns, legends, and shadows. By the time the frontier towns grew beyond a handful of cabins, stories began to spread like wildfire. Stories of men who faced death with a steady hand. Stories of women who defended their homes with nothing but grit and a rifle. Stories of villains who lived by the gun and dared anyone to stop them. On the frontier, fact and legend blurred until one became the other. Law was fragile, stretched thin across miles of wilderness. A sheriff's badge meant little when a single man with a revolver could decide his own rules. Many towns had no real sheriff at all, only men elected for their toughness or sometimes hired guns with questionable pasts. Justice rode on horseback, armed with a Colt or a Winchester, and the line between hero and outlaw was as thin as the smoke rising from a spent pistol. In these dusty streets, figures began to emerge: the lawmen who stood tall, and the outlaws who dared defy them. Some were real, hardened by hunger and survival. Others were crafted in the telling, their stories growing larger with every retelling around a campfire. To settlers weary of endless toil, these figures became symbols of justice, of rebellion, of the untamed spirit that lived in the land. Saloon doors swung open to reveal more than drink and music. They were stages for confrontation. A gambler might sit with his hat low, cards found in his hands, eyes sharp as daggers. A drifter might lean against the bar, silent, waiting for trouble to find him. Whiskey flowed, fists flew, and sometimes bullets followed. Every town had its share of fights, some ending in laughter, others in blood on the floorboards. Yet even as danger lurked, courage flourished. A farmer's wife could pick up a rifle when raiders threatened, defending her children with a shot. As steady as any man's, a young boy might carry messages across hostile trails, riding harder than fear itself. A preacher, armed only with faith, might stand before hardened gunmen and remind them of a higher law. On the frontier, survival demanded more than muscle. It demanded bravery, quick thinking, and sometimes a touch of mercy. But for every tale of heroism, there were whispers of darker shadows. Outlaws roamed the vast spaces between towns, striking where law could not reach. They robbed stagecoaches, trains, and travelers, vanishing into canyons and forests that swallowed pursuit. Their names traveled faster than their bullets, feared, hated, and secretly admired. For in their defiance, many saw a reflection of the frontier itself, wild, free, unwilling to bow to any authority. The newspapers in the East seized on these stories, printing lurid headlines that turned flesh and blood men into myths. A shootout in a dusty street became a tale of epic proportions. A robbery in the dead of night became a saga of daring. Soon, the frontier was no longer just land, it was legend. Songs were sung, dime novels printed, and even those who had never set foot on the plains could imagine the crack of gunfire and the whistle of the wind through ghost towns. And yet, behind the glamour of legend, life remained hard. Ordinary people paid the price of chaos. A shopkeeper's window shattered by stray bullets, a family's wagon stolen by bandits, a child orphaned by violence. For them, there was no romance in the gun. There was only fear and the quiet prayer that tomorrow would be safer. Still, out of hardship rose resilience. Communities formed posses to chase outlaws. Sheriffs, flawed though they were, did their best to hold order. Some succeeded through force, others through respect earned by fair judgment. When a town managed to tame its streets, it was not only a victory of lot, was a declaration that civilization, however fragile, could hold its ground against the chaos of the wild. Evenings often ended with fires burning low. Families gathered around, telling stories of what had been seen or heard. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of lawmen who never flinched, outlaws who vanished like ghosts, women who stood unbroken. These stories, half real and half dream, were seeds of a larger myth, the myth of the American frontier. A myth that would outlive the men and women who lived it, shaping how generations remembered the struggle, the courage, and the danger by lantern light. In small cabins and noisy saloons, the frontier whispered to all who came, "This is a place where your name can live forever, for good or for ill." And so, men and women rose to that call, stepping into roles larger than themselves. Some became protectors, others predators. Some sought peace, others glory. And in their choices, the legend of the frontier grew, written not on parchment, but in blood, dust, and memory. On roads across the wilderness, the frontier had always belonged to the slother oxen pulling wagons mile by mile, the settler cutting down one tree a day to shape a cabin, the farmer watching seeds break through the soil inch by inch. For decades, the wilderness resisted speed, demanding patience. But then came the railroads, and the pace of everything changed. It began with surveyors marking lines across prairies and mountains, maps filled with dotted paths where none yet existed. Soon came men with picks, shovels, and dynamite, carving through hillsides, blasting tunnels through mountains, laying rails across rivers. Wooden ties and steel rails stretched out like veins across the continent, carrying with them a promise and a warning. The frontier would never be the same. For settlers who had once taken months to reach their new homes, the train was a miracle. Iron horses screamed across the plains, their smokestacks belching black clouds, their whistles echoing for miles. What had been endless silence was now filled with the rhythm of wheels clattering on rails. A journey that once killed oxen and starved families could now be made in days, with passengers staring wide-eyed from windows as landscapes rolled by in blur. The towns along the rails transformed overnight. Once sleepy crossroads became bustling centers of trade. Goods arrived in quantities never dreamed of: flour, tools, fabrics, even luxuries like china and coffee. Farmers could now sell crops not only to neighbors but to markets hundreds of miles away. Miners could ship ore and coal by the ton. The frontier, once isolated, was now connected to the beating heart of the nation. But progress carried shadows. For the native tribes, the iron rails cut deeper than any axe. The buffalo herds, once endless, began to vanish under hunters who rode trains west with rifles in hand. Carcasses littered the plains, hides stripped for profit, the great beasts, nearly exterminated within a generation. And with the buffalo gone, so too went the lifeblood of many tribes, their food, clothing, tools, even their spirit. Treaties crumbled as fast as the rails grew, and the clash between cultures turned into full wars. Workers, too, paid dearly for the iron roads. Chinese laborers bent their backs in the heat of summer and the frost of winter, hammering spikes into frozen ground, carrying stone in baskets balanced on shoulders. Irish immigrants swung hammers until their hands bled, their songs drowned out by explosions that tore through mountain rock. Accidents were common: men buried alive in collapses, blown apart by blasts, or swept away by rivers while building trestles. The railroads were monuments not only to progress but to sacrifice, written in sweat and blood. Still, for many settlers, the rails were freedom. A woman who once feared isolation on the prairie could now send letters by train, receive parcels from relatives back east, or even travel herself when illness struck. A farmer who once bartered for survival could now dream of wealth, his wheat or cattle carried to distant cities. The rails did not only move goods, they moved hope, ambition, and dreams of a better tomorrow. The landscape itself seemed to bow to the rails. Forests fell faster to feed the hunger for ties. Hills were leveled, valleys bridged, rivers crossed. With iron, where once silence had reigned, now came the shriek of whistles and the pounding of wheels. Some mourned the loss, the quiet beauty of untouched land, the old ways of life fading into memory. Others rejoiced, seeing in every mile of track the march of progress. the proof that the wilderness could indeed be mastered. But the truth lay somewhere in between. The rails gave, and they took. They gave connection, commerce, and speed. They took solitude, tradition, and the old rhythm of life. Families who had once lived by the turning of the seasons now lived by the timetable of trains. The wilderness was no longer a boundless horizon. It was a route, a corridor, a thing measured by miles of track dot in the evenings. Settlers would gather by the rails, watching the great engines thunder past. Children waved at strangers leaning from windows, marveling at the faces of travelers who came from places they could only imagine. For a moment, the frontier felt less lonely, less distant. The world had come to them, carried on iron wheels. Yet, beneath the wonder, some wondered if something had been lost. The old frontier spirit, the sense of isolation, of raw struggle against the land was fading. Progress was bringing comfort, yes, but also a new kind of dependence. No longer was survival purely the work of one's own hands. Now it came tied to the whistle of a train. Still, the rails could not be stopped. They grew like roots across the continent, binding east to west, weaving the wilderness into the fabric of the nation. The frontier was no longer just a place of survival. It was becoming a stage of transformation, where old ways collided with new, and the iron roads marked the turning point of history. The wilderness still beckoned, but its voice was changing. No longer did it whisper only of hardship and isolation. Now it roared with the sound of locomotives, a promise and a warning, both. The frontier was no longer untamed. It was being reshaped, mile by mile, into something new. The last horizon. By the end of the 19th century, whispers began to spread. The frontier was closing. The endless wilderness that had once stretched beyond imagination was now mapped, fenced, and claimed. The Census Bureau announced that there was no longer a clear frontier line, no place left on the map that could be called untamed. To many, it was a triumph. To others, it was a loss too deep to measure. The great buffalo herds were gone, their bones bleaching under the sun where once they had thundered by the millions. Native tribes, whose ancestors had walked the prairies for centuries, were pushed onto reservations, their traditions under siege, their freedom cut away mile by mile. The railroads stitched the land from coast to coast, carrying goods, armies, and settlers faster than the wild could resist. The frontier, the great unknown, was now known, and in being known, it began to vanish. But those who had lived its harsh truth knew better. They knew the frontier was more than land. It was spirit. It was the courage of families who had left behind the familiar two-faced storms, hunger, and loneliness. It was the faith of mothers who sang to their children in cabins, rattled by the wind. It was the steel in the eyes of men who faced danger with little more than grit. Even as the maps filled, the spirit remained, carved into the bones of those who had endured. For the children of the frontier, life no longer meant endless travel or the terror of starvation each winter. They grew up in towns with schools, churches, and stores where shelves were lined with goods shipped from faraway cities. Yet, when they listened to their parents and grandparents tell stories of nights spent on frozen trails, of wolves howling outside campfires, of clashes with outlaws and raids, at dawn they understood they were living in the shadow of something extraordinary. Out of this shadow, legends bloomed. The dime novels of the East exaggerated and glamorized the frontier, turning weary farmers into heroes, outlaws into infamous rebels, lawmen into larger-than-life figures. Soon, the world looked westward, not to see hardship, but to dream of freedom, bravery, and adventure. The truth was harder, dirtier, more painful, but the legend became its own kind of truth, shaping how generations remembered the struggle. Still, for those who remembered, the legend was not enough. They carried scars too deep to be captured in songs or novels. They remembered the graves dug in frozen ground, the hunger that gnawed like a wolf at the door, the friends lost to sickness, accidents, or violence. They remembered the loneliness, the vast silence of a prairie night where the stars stretched endlessly above, but no other soul was near. And yet, they also remembered the beauty sunrises over endless fields, the laughter of children running barefoot through new soil, the pride of building a life where once there had been only wilderness. The closing of the frontier was not a single moment, but a slow tightening. Fences divided what was once open range. Laws defined boundaries that had once been free. Land that had been walked by buffalo, then plowed by pioneers, now echoed with the hum of machines. Progress swept forward, unstoppable. But the old frontier spirit lingered, refusing to die. For in every man or woman who pushed against the odds, who sought freedom in new lands or new dreams, the spirit of the frontier lived on. It lived in the immigrant arriving in a strange city, with nothing but hope. It lived in the worker who braved hardship for a better future. It lived in the dreamers who looked not westward, but upward to the sky, to the stars, to new frontiers waiting to be discovered. The last horizon of the American frontier was not only a line on a map, it was a mirror, reflecting both the greatness and the grief of a nation's birth. It told of courage, but also of loss. It carried the songs of settlers, but also the silenced voices of tribes displaced. It bore witness to triumph and tragedy, progress and destruction. The frontier gave America its story, but it asked a heavy price. As the 20th century dawned, old settlers sat on porches of houses built where once wagons had camped. Their hands, once hardened by axes and plows, trembled with age, yet their eyes, when they looked at the horizon, still saw it not just fields or fences, but the great unknown that had once called them forward. They smiled, knowing they had answered that call. The wilderness was no longer wild, but its memory was eternal. It lived in the songs sung by firelight, in the myths of gunslingers and pioneers, in the quiet pride of families who traced their roots back to the ones who endured. It lived in the heartbeat of a nation that had been shaped by the courage to step into the unknown. The frontier had closed, but the spirit of the frontier, resilient, restless, unyielding, would never close. It would live on, as long as there were new horizons to chase, and new stories to tell.